So welcome everybody. Thank you very much for joining. This is our the first of Dataiku's AI governance web series focusing on the EU AI Act. Today I'll be covering unpacking the EU AI Act. So this is basically covering the main interventions that are pushed forward by the Act. As for who I am, my name is Jacob Beswick. I am the Director for AI Governance Solutions at Dataiku. I lead a global team that works with organizations, again, globally across sectors, on helping to refine AI governance processes and translate them into our product and specifically govern, which you'll learn more about in a later web series. But for today, we are focusing on the EU AI Act. Here's our agenda. I won't waste precious time on it, but if you're a speed reader, you will have read it all. So let's kick off. First, why the EU AI Act? What is it all about? And in the interest of not suffering saying EU AI Act multiple times over this presentation, I will just refer to it as the Act. Principally, the Act is concerned with protecting EU citizens. So it does this by promoting the uptake of human-centric and trustworthy AI while ensuring a high level of protection of health, safety, fundamental rights, all while protecting against harmful effects of AI systems and, importantly, supporting innovation. So there's a balancing act there for the keen-eyed. I'm going to be covering these three main interventions today. The first is the risk tiering that is proposed within the Act. The risk tiering applies to AI systems, and I'm going to use AI systems and AI use cases interchangeably. The next is new obligations facing general purpose AI models and model providers. Now, there's a key distinction here already to make, namely that the first intervention focuses on AI systems. The second intervention focuses on models. This is more than an academic point of interest, and we'll explain why later on. And then finally, we will discuss the penalty regime for non-compliance, which goes as high as 35 million euro or up to 7% of annual worldwide turnover for the previous fiscal year. So I'm so sorry if you're hearing my background noise. We got lots of dings. Let's talk about the key stakeholders. I've created an artificial kind of buckets. The first includes market participants, and the second is comprised of market or enforcement actors. So let's talk about the market participants very quickly. I won't talk about all of them because I think there are three critical ones for probably this audience. They include deployers. So these are organizations that are actually operationalizing AI systems. Providers. These are organizations who are either based within the EU or outside of the EU, but selling AI systems into the EU. And then GPay or general purpose AI model providers. Now, importantly, you've got these other actors, entities like authorized representatives, distributors, and also importers who aren't on the screen, that sort of orbit providers. And another important thing to note is that deployers can quite quickly become providers. So for example, a deployer might be consuming third-party AI systems and then might modify one substantively, at which point they become the provider of that system, even though they're also the deployer. Within the EU AI Act, the lion's share of new obligations fall on these three. Now, if we move over to enforcement, I will not be able to go through all of these, but I will focus on these two. But effectively, the key themes of what these enforcement actors do, they enforce the EU AI Act. They ensure that it's being rolled out well through things like guidance, codes of conduct, which we'll discuss later on. They conduct investigations. Of the two that are highlighted, notified bodies play an important role as an impartial third-party entity, so it's not a public sector entity, that conducts conformity assessments, in particular for high-risk systems, which we'll talk about later, so that basically the regulators can be assured that the deployer of that system is conforming to the law. And then we have market surveillance authorities. So these exist at the state level. So state by state, there will be a market surveillance authority. And they act as a single point of contact regarding the AI Act, which will include receiving complaints. They have enforcement powers concerning the requirements laid out in the regulation, which you'll hear more about. And they also have supervision responsibilities. There's more, but I do want to focus on another element of their remit, which is that they can coordinate, or they will coordinate, with the European Commission on things like conducting investigations, promoting compliance, identifying non-compliance, raising awareness, and so on. So we'll move on from the key players, and we'll talk about that first intervention, which is the risk tiering. So the risk tiering is spread out over 4 levels. At the most kind of extreme level is the unacceptable risk tier. This is just kind of characterized by having an untenable potential for harm. Below that, the high risk tier, which is characterized by posing a serious potential for harm. And what's important is this tier is associated with the greatest kind of burden of obligations. Under that is the limited risk tier. As you might not be surprised, there's some potential for harm. And then, of course, there's the minimal risk tier with no potential for harm. So if we move, we're going to walk through each level. The first are the prohibited AI systems, which fall within the unacceptable risk tier. I'm not good. Look, what I've done is I've looked at Act 5 of the EU AI Act, if you want reference, and I've drawn out kind of a high level of what each AI system or use case, which is described as falling into this category. I'll talk about them very quickly just to give you a thematic notion of what's covered here. So things that are prohibited include AI systems that are intended to subliminally manipulate people or exploit protected characteristics to distort behavior in a way that's harmful. AI systems that evaluate or classify people using social behavior or actual predicted or inferred characteristics, and in a way that ultimately leads to harmful, unfavorable, or detrimental treatment. Using personal information to predict criminal behavior, using AI systems to create or expand facial recognition databases through scraping web or CCTV data, inferring emotions at the workplace or in educational institutions, biometric categorization systems based on protected characteristics, and real-time biometric identification systems in public spaces by law enforcement, but there are some exceptions. Now, if you think your organization is investing in any of these for any particular reason, I'd strongly recommend you encourage your legal team to review Article 5 because, quite simply, these are prohibited from being put on the market. They cannot be deployed. We're going to quickly move now to the high-risk AI systems tier, which, as I mentioned before, is kind of the most onerous in terms of new obligations. There's 2 tracks to identifying a high-risk AI system. The first track is quite straightforward. It's a list found in Annex 3. What you're seeing on the screen are 6 domains, but it's kind of tricky because, in fact, there are more than that, and I'll explain why in a minute. I'll quickly run through them, and then I'll focus on 2 which I think have the widest market relevance. So with respect to biometric identification, categorization, and emotion recognition, it is what it says on the tin. Using AI in this way would qualify as a high-risk AI system. With respect to the second, using AI to operate critical infrastructure such as digital, road, supply of water, gas, heating, electricity would qualify. For education and vocational training, this is really about evaluating, using AI to determine access to or evaluating or recommending opportunities for or detecting cheating, all in relation to kind of schooling. And I'm going to skip these 2 for now because I'm going to focus on them in a moment. But public authorities is really comprised of 3 domains. This includes the administration of justice and democratic processes, law enforcement, and managing borders and immigration. So if you work at an organization that is installing facial recognition systems on borders, you might want to consider the high-risk system and how it might affect you. Now, for these 2, I'll start with employment, worker management, and access to self-employment. I find this interesting because when I talk to organizations, kind of no matter where they are, and they're looking to leverage AI systems to optimize certain parts of the business, HR seems to be like a common denominator. And fundamentally, this domain is preoccupied with things like using AI in the selection or placement of targeted ads, job ads, to analyze or filter job applications and to evaluate candidates, to make decisions affecting terms of work like promotion, termination, demotion, allocating tasks based on individuals' behavior, personal traits or characteristics, or monitoring and evaluating the performance and behavior of persons. Now, with respect to access to essential private and public services and benefits, this includes things like welfare, but it also includes things like using AI to determine creditworthiness or credit score. And we might think that this is the strict domain of financial services, and we're right that it is relevant to that space. But I am thinking about scenarios where an organization might sell a product or a service on a website to an end consumer. And I think we're all too familiar with this. There's an option to select kind of a payment plan. That payment plan might be put in place by the organization itself or a third party. And where that payment plan, either today or in future, leverages AI to determine basically access to that finance in order to make that purchase, I would wonder whether it would qualify as a high-risk system. And if this is resonating with you, I'd encourage you to talk to your legal teams. Now, the list here that I've gone through very quickly is found, as I mentioned, in the annexes. One important note is that this is not fixed. This is expected to change over time under the penship of the European Commission. Whoops. So let's go to track 2. Track 2 is a little bit different and a little bit more interesting and complicated. So track 2, the 2 conditions must be met for an AI system to be deemed high risk. The first is that it's intended to be used as a safety component of a product, or is itself a product, in the context of a regulated space where a third-party conformity assessment is required. And there is a very long list provided in Annex 1 of all the harmonized legislation relevant to this. I will not go through this. I am not a specialist in any of this legislation. However, in the interest of making this material to you, I wanted to talk about 2 hypotheticals. The first is the idea that you might think of an organization using machinery or an AI system to predict assembly line failures and take mitigating actions, whether that's to recommend a human intervene or stop the assembly line altogether. I would expect that that sort of use case or AI system would qualify as high risk. And then in the context of medical devices, this one's easy because I am diabetic. It's the idea of using AI in insulin pumps. So for example, we've moved a long way with insulin pump technology, now using AI systems to predict hypo and hyperglycemia, and either taking automatic or recommended courses of action to mitigate that outcome. In either of those situations, I would highly suspect that that would qualify as high risk. But now there's a bit more to this. An organization in this space is already, complying with existing legislative frameworks. They're doing conformity assessments. And the Act nods to the fact that organizations will have to navigate multiple frameworks. And in the interest of ensuring consistency and avoiding administrative burden, there's an option to give such organizations, quote, flexibility with regard to operational decisions on how to ensure compliance with multiple regulatory frameworks, which seems user-friendly, and we are expecting guidance on this, and we'll talk about that at the very end. Now let's talk about the so what of this. Previously I mentioned quite simply, here it is not so quite simply. This is basically the what must happen if you have a high-risk AI system. You are looking at a representation of an AI system's lifecycle, where here we're starting and here we're in post-deployment. We'll start with what happens upfront. So you must comply with 7 requirements, which are articulated across Articles 8 through 15. These are the 7 requirements. They each occupy about a space, a page or 2 pages or 3 pages worth of text. I'd recommend that if you think you have high-risk AI systems at play in your organization or you plan to, you read this. For now, I'll give you a very high-level notion of what's included here, starting going kind of sequentially. So we'll start with risk management systems. We know that these have to be in place. We know that it has to be a continuous process and that it has to extend across the entire life cycle. Broadly, it needs to be able to identify foreseeable risks, unsurprisingly, evaluate and qualify and manage these risks. That same function, it's not just upfront. It's not just before you go pushing towards deployment. It's after you've deployed. You need to continue monitoring and managing risks. Next is data and data governance. This sets out requirements for training, validation, and testing data sets, and it speaks to considerations around design choices, data collection, and preparation processes. Fundamentally, the data sets used need to be relevant to the AI system and its, quote, intended purpose. That idea of an intended purpose is really crucial to all compliance activities because it sets the foundation for basically evidencing that you are able to deliver on that intended purpose without risk of harm. The data sets need to be relevant, and the AI system needs to set out some requirements associated with protected data. Next is technical documentation. I'm not going to go into this. Its fundamental purpose is to prove that the AI system is compliant. This is to my knowledge, the only requirement that has its own very own annex found in Annex 4, which gives a kind of minimum viable technical documentation list. We move to record keeping. So record keeping, you effectively have to have the ability to automatically record events over the lifetime of the system. And that includes every time that high-risk system has actually been operationalized. This in turn facilitates things like post-market monitoring, which we'll touch on later. Transparency for high-risk systems is different from transparency, which I'll talk later about, limited risk AI systems. But for now, transparency needs to be designed into the system. It needs end users need to be able to actually use it. They need to be able to interpret outputs, and they need to use the system appropriately. And this includes things like instructions for use, contact information of the provider, and key characteristics about the system, including its capabilities and limitations. Human oversight, this is not earth-shattering, but it's useful to know that it's one of the requirements. Effectively, a high-risk system needs to be designed so that humans can oversee it over the course of its development and deployment. Interestingly, human oversight is articulated in a way respects for proportionality. So basically, the level of oversight must correspond to or be commensurate to the level of risk, autonomy, context of use. And then finally, accuracy, robustness, and cybersecurity, all three lumped together. Cybersecurity, this is effectively the high-risk AI system needs to be secure from external threat. Robustness, it needs to be resilient to any kind of perturbations in data or the context in which it's been applied. And accuracy is interesting. If you're scratching your heads because I've given you a very high-level notion of what all these things are, I think you might continue scratching your heads when reading the text. There's an expectation that guidance will come out to facilitate understanding of how these things can actually be delivered upon. Right now, I am of the opinion that we're still in this kind of space of both prognostication and hypothesis. So if we move on, you've set up or established a way to comply with your 7 requirements. You've done things like conduct a fundamental rights impact assessment, which I'm not going to touch on. You then get to the space of thinking you're deployment ready. And at this point, you will have to, I was talking about this earlier, conduct a conformity assessment with the notified body. And for your reference, I got all the articles if you wish to read the exact text. And once you receive a certificate that you are in fact in conformity, you will articulate, you as an organization will write up a declaration of conformity. You will affix a CE marking to your high-risk AI system in some way, and then you will register it in an EU database, at which point you are ready for deployment. But it doesn't end there, because once you've deployed, you have to ensure that you have a post-market monitoring system in place where you are establishing and documenting basically ensuring that the risks that you have identified are not kind of coming up, and that any risks that do arise, you're able to cope with them or mitigate them, all with the view to continuous compliance. And should anything become egregious, you have to report any serious incidents to the market surveillance authorities, which I mentioned earlier. Now we'll move down the risk levels to the limited risk AI systems. Look, these are generally defined in terms of being AI that generate or manipulate image, audio, video content. With respect to video content constituting a deepfake, it also includes text. And in addition to this kind of AI-generated content, it includes chatbots. So you see on the screen what we've all collectively witnessed over the past several years. We've got Pope in a coat. We've got Deep Tom Cruise. This I just saw recently. Netflix has apparently used AI to manipulate images in a true crime documentary. And then, of course, we have, because I'm based in the UK, King Charles doing a jig, all of which are generated by artificial intelligence. These would qualify as limited risk AI systems. What do you do about this? Quite simply, you have to disclose the existence of such generated or manipulated content. So you might imagine in the world we are in context of AI systems distorting the public space, so politics, etc., this requirement becomes increasingly important. For chatbots, the requirement, my computer doesn't like me. For chatbots, the requirement is that the AI system needs to be designed and developed in a way that end users are aware they're interacting with an AI system. And you can find this in Article 50. We'll move down again to the minimal risk AI systems. According to European Union documentation, this is the vast majority of AI systems currently used in the EU. The 2 examples that are given time and again, spam filters and AI-enabled video games or non-playable characters in video games. But if we stretch our imaginations ever so slightly, we might think of other scenarios which would qualify as minimal risk. I am not a lawyer. Do not consider this legal advice if you use such systems, but in my estimation, these would qualify. So that might be AI systems that are used in optimizing logistics and supply chains, telling when trucks should drive out, when boats should arrive, et cetera, et cetera. And we might extend that to an office environment where AI systems are optimizing scheduling, when should Dr. A come in, when should Dr. Y leave, and so on. And then AI systems in the home, for example, AI systems using that are optimizing electricity usage. We might think of a Nest, so long as all it is doing is basing its predictions or optimizations on previous inputs into temperature, my expectation is that it would qualify. So what do you have to do about this? Quite simply, the minimal risk tier has no new obligations and everything you do is voluntary. Providers of AI, no, here's an important caveat, Article 95, that relates to both the minimal risk tier, but also the limited risk tier. So AI systems that are not high risk, those providers should be encouraged to create codes of conduct, including related governance mechanisms intended to foster the voluntary application of some or all of the mandatory requirements applicable to high-risk AI systems. From my perspective, that's a stretch because those high-risk requirements can be quite extensive. But ultimately, this is at the discretion of your organization, your team, however you can allocate those responsibilities. And we have the expectation that guidance on this will be forthcoming. Now, what's worth mentioning, mandatory requirements, in my understanding, refers to the 7 requirements I went through earlier, and not the laundry list of things that happen after that, like doing conformity assessments, affixing CE markings, etc. So now we're going to pivot to the second of the 3 interventions. Note that we are complying with the transparency obligations for the limited risk tier. For general purpose AI models, there are a number of interventions. I'll start at the start. I mentioned earlier that distinct from the risk tiering and the regulation of AI systems, the focus on general purpose AI models, which we might call generative AI, and general purpose AI models get their own kind of specific space because of their ability to be applied in multiple contexts. They're not single purpose models. The regulation here focuses at the model level, not the use case level. However, the use case level will still be relevant, and I'll explain how in a moment. There are 2 tiers of general purpose AI models. One just called general purpose AI models. There's a little bit of distinction here between open versus closed models, where closed models are facing the lion's share. They have more kind of requirements associated with them. General purpose models presenting systemic risk is the other tier. And this is interesting because it's basically determined by the volume of compute used. I do not have the exact number. And is also defined by the notion that they have high impact capabilities. And that includes having the potential to have negative effects in relation to major accidents, disruptions of critical sectors, serious consequences to public health and safety, any actual or reasonably foreseeable negative effects on democratic processes, public or economic security. Now, if we move along, independent of the tier, both of these kind of the model providers of both these kind of models will face similar requirements. So they have to maintain up-to-date technical documentation, including training and testing processes and evaluation results. They have to enable providers of AI systems integrating these models to have a good understanding of the capabilities and limitations. They have to make publicly available a sufficiently detailed summary about content used for training. And they have to comply, of course, with copyright legal obligations. I'm not going to go into the detail for GPA models presenting systemic risks. Needless to say, they have more work to do before their models are put on the market. Why does this matter to a group of people who are probably not GPA model providers? Quite simply, the new requirements that I've just mentioned should set expectations for market actors. So if you're a deployer of an AI system, so you've built an AI system and want to integrate this third-party general purpose model, you should expect this kind of documentation, and it should feature into any compliance activities you have ongoing. So if you have a high-risk AI system using ChatGPT-4, you need their technical documentation to kind of build up your own. What's also important to note, and I wasn't going to go into this, but I will quickly say it. is that an organization, downstream user of an OpenAI model, who does significant modification and fine tuning on that model and then puts it into deployment on the market, kind of under their own name, becomes a deployer of a general purpose AI model, and they are hit with the obligations I've just laid out. Importantly, there's a bit of complementarity here. They don't have to do all the work. They just have to show their work for what the changes they've made. Now we're going to pivot out of these three interventions and do a little bit of a thought experiment. So I've told you about all these requirements. Hopefully you're still awake. Here they are in a very ugly slide. If we're at a state where we know that these requirements are hitting, how can we begin to prepare, especially if we don't have certainty about how to actually deliver on these things or comply with them? First, I'd encourage you to get a really as deep an understanding as possible of these requirements and think in terms of how will this impact the organization from a change management perspective. Which managers will need to be responsible? They need to have a detailed enough understanding so that they can think in terms of how different parts of the org, maybe your data science and engineering teams will be impacted, will be hit. Your data science and engineering teams might need to do new things. They might need to refine things they are doing. And finally, your administrative impact will hit, bringing in probably everybody, including your legal and compliance teams, who will have to have access to important materials that are produced by those managers and produced by those data science and engineering teams in order to, demonstrate compliance going forward. Why bother? Well, if you're an organization in America or anywhere, if you're an organization outside of the EU and the EU is one of your main markets and you're selling systems that feature limited or high-risk AI systems into Europe, you need to be compliant. You have to demonstrate compliance. You have to go through the conformity assessment process if it's a high-risk system. And if you do not, you face pretty steep fines. So really, compliance is the only option if you are selling within or into Europe. First, let's talk about the unacceptable risk here. I kind of alluded to this earlier. This is the highest level kind of penalty, up to 35 million or 7% of total worldwide annual turnover for the previous financial year. High risk and limited risk non-compliance gets hits with 15 million and 3%, 15 million or 3% of annual worldwide turnover. And in the case of doing your compliance activity badly, well, you also get hit for this. So if you supply incorrect, incomplete, or misleading information, you can face fines up to 7.5 million or up to 1% total worldwide annual turnover. So we're going to wrap up now. The EU Act establishes a number of interventions. I've really focused on three narrow ones, but there's a lot of nuance that I've missed today. So I will throw my hands up and confess that. First, the risk levels that I mentioned and the focus on AI systems. I hope it encourages organizations or you to think through understanding, well, what are the assets I have at play in my organization today? What are we planning to have in the future? Can we map them out? And we will need to map them out in the future. We will need to qualify them. This is fundamental. Because if you don't do this, you expose yourself to risk of non-compliance. These new obligations for general purpose AI model providers. Again, if you're a consumer of these models, I strongly think in terms of, well, set expectations that this information will be provided to you, and you have to carefully incorporate it into your other governance activities. And then finally, the idea of non-compliance, I hope, motivates you to kind of do what I was hinting at in the last slide, which is kind of prepare, anticipate, think in terms of, okay, if we're going to be hit by a number of new requirements and obligations, how should we be preparing to adapt? And let's talk a little bit about logistics. So right now we're awaiting what's called official publication in the European Journal. Once that happens, there's a 20-day countdown, and after that 20 days is complete, there's a cascade of requirements that hit the market. Importantly, within 6 months, there's a ban on the unacceptable risks here. So those prohibited AI systems can no longer be placed on the market. After 12 months from that 20 days, rules for general purpose AI model providers and high-risk AI systems hit. And then after 2 years, the whole EU AI Act is applied. And you might think, but how still, Jacob, you've not told us at all how we do it. And I'm not the guy to tell you how to do it. I'm the guy to tell you you need to start thinking about planning. For now, you should expect this from different European entities, right? Codes of conduct, codes of practice, standardization activities, and guidance that'll help with a lot of the really important things. So for example, That idea of what I mentioned at the end of the minimal risk tier, that idea of voluntarily applying some of the high risk requirements to your governance process, there should be guidance on that, or codes of conduct on that. Obligations for providers of general purpose AI models, clarity will come through guidance. Transparency obligations associated with detection and labeling of artificial generative manipulated content. So that kind of transparency stamp for the limited risk tier, again, we should expect some guidance. And so on and so on. Most importantly, I think is this. Fundamentally, there will be guidance on the practical implementation of the EU Act. And in the meantime, many organizations, including my own, will try to figure out ways to prepare for that. What to leave you with? Well, I'd encourage you to ask yourself a few questions, which I've hinted at earlier. Can you say that you know all the AI systems currently operationalized in development across your org? And if you can say that, are you confident about the risk levels of those? Are you confident about whether you're a deployer or a provider, or both? Are you confident that there's a team or in your organization or maybe teams that are getting ready for the EU AI Act? And as a sub-question of that, do you know the lead person's name? And if you don't, I'd encourage you to explore, because hopefully there's some work being done and you don't have to come up with figuring all this out on your own. In terms of what next to figure out from us, we'll have another webinar in the series that's going to be focused on the key pillars for achieving readiness, which I alluded to. And then after that, we will have a session focusing on building a system of trust, which is kind of wider relevance beyond just the EU AI Act. And that is the very quick whistle-stop tour of the unpacking of the EU AI Act. I hope you found it useful. And I think we're going to pivot to a little bit of a Q&A.
Thank you so much, Jacob, for the presentation. Really insightful. We did get some audience questions, so I'm going to start us off with a fairly softball question, but someone was asking, does the EU Act impact the UK?
I just opened it up and saw that question. In fact, if you are an organization operating within the UK and selling into Europe, then yes. It's not that the UK will absorb the EU AI Act at a legal level, a legislative level. They're discrete. So the UK has its own approach to AI regulation, which is much more decentralized, its own kind of legal frameworks. So to repeat, if you're an organization operating in any country outside of Europe but selling into Europe, the EU AI Act bears relevance to you. It's like GDPR. But if you are an organization operating in another country and have nothing to do with Europe, you just follow domestic legal frameworks.
Awesome. And so we had a second question as well when you were speaking about the different risk tiers. So someone was asking, does the healthcare system belong to a high risk tier?
The healthcare system?
Healthcare system.
So as I understand it, it relates to, there's explicit mention of, it depends on the AI system at play. So if you're using AI to, as I mentioned earlier, that very silly, kind of not silly, made up use case of using AI to optimize back office function in a healthcare function, then no, doesn't really bear relevance. If you're using it, I would argue, again, I'm not a lawyer, I would argue that if you are using AI as a safety mechanism in any kind of equipment in an office or in a hospital, or AI as a product in equipment in a hospital, then I would argue probably does qualify as a high risk because of that second track, if you recall. But again, ask your own legal team. That's my view.
So one of the key themes seems to be ask your legal team just to confirm.
Yeah, no, that's my big cop out. And I just for transparency with the team I lead, one of the first things we say when we work on legislative topics is that we are not providing you guarantee of compliance. We will provide you insight to the best of our abilities and support with readiness and implementation. But we do encourage that if it's a legal determination, it has to be an internal decision to your company. I wouldn't rely on me.
Fantastic. So we have another question. What measures key players are taking regarding the EU Act?
That's an interesting one. When we say key players, I'll just refer to my exposure to different kinds of organizations across the globe. There's increasing interest outside of Europe. There's, of course, increasing interest inside of Europe. There's a pretty good understanding that the exact kind of approach for compliance is still fuzzy, but there is an increasing kind of appetite for getting ready. Like, how do we really kind of start thinking and preparing for this? A lot of that relates to wider governance considerations, which starts with topics like, can I understand all the assets that I have at play in my organization? Do I have a registry function? Can I consistently qualify? Can I ensure that we have some kind of review and sign-off practice that before things go to deployment? So there are kind of the small steps in this direction are starting with how do we get smart about kind of governance practices.
Fantastic. Another question has come in. Should users be informed if a content, text, or image is generated by an AI system?
Yep, that's that limited risk tier.
Perfect. Okay, so we have a little bit of a longer questions here. So we operate a startup. We will be implementing several AI systems, amongst other detecting stress amongst users in our system in order to be able to detect if we should change our system to help users diminish stress. As of what size a company has to abide with the system, number of company staff, or a number of clients served in the financial turnover.
I just read that, Johan, and I'm smiling because it's one of the things I intentionally skipped. So it applies to every organization. I'm going to put my hands up and confess, look, there are stipulations for SMEs and micro enterprises. So I would recommend, there's a lot that the European Commission in their first draft and European kind of other entities have supported because it's been maintained over the course of the lifetime of the EU Act to ensure that innovation can still happen in Europe. I'm assuming you're based in Europe. If you are, you will have resources made available to you according to the Act that will help with compliance. I don't know these in great detail, but if you just Google or if you control find SME on the EU AI Act, you will find that there are a lot of provisions to make sure that the EU AI Act basically doesn't kill innovation. It includes things like sandboxes. It includes things like guidance. It includes there are other things that are kind of outside of the EU Act, but coming out of the coordinated action plan, like access to other services. So there should be a lot available to you.
Fantastic. We're getting great questions from the audience. We have another one coming in here. What about auditability? Are there any specific considerations under this act?
I wish I knew what a little bit more precise for the question. So auditability is kind of implied, I think. Within the high risk requirements, the idea of audit's not really coming up. Effectively, a conformity assessment requires that you articulate a whole lot of information about that AI system, which could function like an audit. Actually, I'm going to take a step back. I don't know how many of you are based in the UK. Hopefully, I think a few of you. A few years ago, maybe a year and a bit ago, there's something called the DRCF, the Digital Regulator Cooperation Forum, and they published a paper on AI audit, in which they were quoted somebody, which I love, and I will never forget this quote, that AI audit on the market globally is currently the Wild West. I think as things like the EU AI Act and other regulation become more formalized, audit will become more tractable. As for what the AI Act itself says about audit, nothing's springing to mind.
All right, so we have another question from Mark. How are traditional data governance practices transferable and applicable to new governance requirements for AI?
That is a good question. I think so if we go into, look, in general or with respect to the AI Act, sorry, can you repeat that?
With respect to the AI Act.
Okay. The data and data governance elements of the AI Act have provided a little bit of information about what's expected. I don't know basically who owns the data, who from a data governance perspective, where does it sit, who owns it, who can access it, I think become increasingly relevant in ensuring that that's maintained across the course of access rights when developing an AI system. There's nothing really, I'm just kind of scratching my head about this one. David even might be a better person to answer that, but I might skip that one because I think I'll do it a disservice. But it's a good question.
Yeah, no worries, Jacob. We do have a couple more if you're still up for it.
I'm up for it. Give me a softball.
So next question here from Robert. Do you have any recommendations on best practice documentation to produce around testing strategies, test cases, and test results for the AI system, including any coverage of metrics and defect reports?
That's a fantastic question. And no, I don't. I wish I did. Basically, we look at the market and we're kind of waiting on this from standards organizations. One of the kind of outliers in this space from a public sector point of view is Singapore. I think the UK might be creeping into this space, maybe. But Singapore has come out with something called AI Verify, which touches exactly on what you're referencing. This idea of, okay, what exactly should we be doing with respect to benchmarking, with bench metrics? We're kind of waiting with bated breath to hear from ISO, maybe even Sensenelec, but in particular, we need that guidance on the full implementation of the AI Act, which we're kind of promised in the EU AI Act for Europe itself. So it's kind of I got happy that I was asked that question because it's kind of amazing that we still don't have best practices out there, but give it time.
All right, so I think we'll take just one more question here. So a fairly softer one as well. So are AI generated media free of copyright and beyond the scope of the Act?
AI generated media free of copyright. I would ask what that AI generated media is based on. How is it generating I think there's an order of operations question. So I'm assuming that an AI system that's generating articles is being fed with something. If it's scanning other newspapers to generate summary articles, then I think it would probably be hit with that copyright issue. But again, ask your lawyer, because I think that's it's not just creating new media. I hope it's not just creating new news stories out of nothing, but there's an order of operations challenge there that you might want to tackle.
Fantastic. Well, I think we're going to end it here, but thank you so much, Jacob, for the great presentation and for answering a lot of the audience questions. To the audience, this is currently recorded and will be available to you after the webinar. We're also going to try and follow up with a lot of the questions that did come in through the Q&A. So not to worry if your question didn't get answered today. And thank you again, Jacob.
Thank you, everybody, for joining. Hopefully you found it informative if you stayed awake. Can I just really quickly respond to Alistair Hughes? Will there be features in Dataiku to help us track compliance? The answer to that is yes. Yep, thank you. Alistair, the answer to that is yes. And in fact, that's one of the core part of the product that my team works on. It's called Govern. You're welcome to look at our website to find out more about it. Future parts of the webinar series will show more about Govern and what we've been doing in the context of the AI Act. All right. Sorry to cut your conclusion off, but thank you, everybody.